everyone, and welcome to the Podcast by Army podcast, where we talk about BTS, Army, fandom, and research. We are your co-hosts, Dr. Kate Ringland
Jhertau Her, a university researcher.
and today we're talking about the Stan Twitterification of genocide and what we can do about this as reasonable, functional humans. Today we have a guest.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Mari, and I will be coming into this space to give a little bit of perspective through my lens as a public health equity specialist. And I specifically focus on how oppressed communities combat detrimental health effects that stem from being oppressed. Some of you may know me as the person who wrote the Yale thesis on BTS and their public health impact during COVID-19. That's actually how I met Dr. Kate on this podcast. She was a phenomenal thesis advisor. And on the day-to-day now, I specialize in looking really at racism and other intersectional forms of oppression, so things like gender and sexuality, and how those things affect people's health. I teach, I research, and I've been really fortunate to be brought up directly in community organizing, community activism, particularly in the Black and Japanese plus Asian American organizing communities that I am part of and identify as. So I'm really excited to be here today, although I wish the circumstances were less fraught.
We're happy to have you. Yay.
Yay, thank you for being here. We appreciate it very much. Yeah, Mari, do you want to talk about just what's happening in the world and how you see it through your own perspective and historical standpoints? We'll say it, by the way, the Palestinian genocide.
Yeah, so I don't know if people have heard, but there is indeed a genocide happening and it's not great. And I think for me as a BTS fan, this particular issue felt really resonant from the beginning because so much of the history and reality of how BTS and other Asian people are racialized and discriminated against is directly related to Palestinian oppression. And that's particularly true when it comes to the history and present occupation in Korea. We talk a lot as a fandom about the various types of anti-Asian racism that BTS faces. This xenophobia or hate against foreigners that are non-Western, also the idea that all Asians in the first place are foreign and perpetually foreign. Everything about sort of BTS being quote unquote not real men, that's also very racialized. And of course, there are also just these sort of stock caricature racist stereotypes about Asian people that we've heard throughout BTS's career. And that Army has been really vocal in pushing back against anyone who has been racist to the boys and racist to Asians in general within our space. And that's been a really important hallmark of the fandom since the beginning, I think, has been this focus on anti-racism, particularly as they've moved into the Western musical market. And all of that stuff collectively has been dubbed Orientalism. And there's a much more technical definition I could give, but all of these sort of things that we've been fighting from an anti-racism perspective really fall under this idea about sort of Asia and the East. And the most prominent writer, the most foremost person who's talked about and has explained this kind of stuff so that we can then call it out when it happens is Edward Said. And Edward Said was a Palestinian. And that is definitely not a coincidence because anti-Arab and anti-Asian racism are fundamentally quite interconnected. And there's a lot of overlap in those communities, even though it might seem at face value that Asian and East Asian communities are really separate from what's happening in the Middle East. Like, borders are fake, everyone's next door to each other, and a lot of sort of conflating of these two populations happened in the beginning, and we still see that in the kind of racism that people face today, even though there are important differences in who and what is said about whom. But I think actually where this is really obvious and where all of this is really connected is in original writing about Zionism, or the idea that politically Jewish folks deserve a sovereign theocratic state. And it doesn't matter if that state is already occupied by people, which is Israel's current argument for its occupation. And I just want to read a quote from the founder of Zionism, because I think when people are asking, why does genocide have to do with us? as BTS fans, and why are we focused as a sort of fandom of non-related, non-attached Korean artists to this particular issue beyond just a general human rights and human decency standpoint. But the founder of Zionism, Theodore Herzl, specifically suggested when he was moving towards what if we colonize Palestine, said we should form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. And this concept of Asians and East Asians in particular as being barbaric, as being threats to civilization and democracy, is one that is used to generate a lot of the racist rhetoric against BTS and also the racist rhetoric against Palestinians. And so those things are one and the same. And also, both of those things are deeply influenced by US military presence and oppression in both regions. So both South Korea and Palestine are occupied. And literally, bombs from the Korean War are being used to bomb Palestine now. And so I think that if you don't think those things are connected or you don't see how those things are connected, I'm hoping that providing a little bit more of a historical lens can make you realize or encourage you to find solidarity or at least do your own research in how South Korea in particular is deeply connected to Palestine and the current racism that enables genocide against Palestinian people. Yeah, woo.
South Korea and Palestine are so closely intertwined. How do you think BTS themselves are intertwined in all of this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think for this, I think they actually have said it themselves, right? When we look at the original purpose of BTS's music, there's a great quote on the Too Cool for School commemorative album explanation text that was released last year. That specifically Too Cool for School is a message on resisting social bias and oppression. And so I think for me, fundamentally, being a BTS fan is supporting resistance against oppressive structures, if not actively standing up for it for yourself. And that was a huge part of what drew me to this fandom, is the idea that it goes beyond music, right? And we talk about this in all kinds of different contexts, but that there is a larger purpose to BTS's music and why they're creating the work that they're creating. And I think that when we talk about what does it mean to support resistance, what does it mean for our artists to provide music that is designed to help people resist oppression, right? We know that there are Palestinian army who have been killed in Gaza. We've seen them wearing their merch in refugee camps. We've seen their photo cards in the rubble. And if you think for 1 second that BTS would not want or would not expect Palestinian army to find comfort in that music or to use their music as a source of strength in resisting oppression, I feel like you've really missed the boat on what BTS has been about since day one, right? And not every song that BTS writes is going to be equally grounded in social political commentary, but there are enough explicitly political songs that discuss this kind of work that I think if you're not reading lyrics and if you're not listening to music deeply, which BTS have said time and time again that they want us to do, then I really don't know how to help you at this point. And so to see people saying that being anti-Zionist or pro-Palestinian is anti-BTS and conflating those two terms is actually so wild to me. And the idea that we wouldn't apply music about resistance to one of the biggest and most public forms of genocide that most of us have seen in our lifetimes, truly incomprehensible. So I think really recognizing that and really grounding yourself in that message and going back to why BTS is important in the first place, right? They don't create all of the music about loving yourself, about healing, if there isn't anything to heal from. And so I think that's really important to recognize within this larger conversation. So given that, it's been really fascinating and terrifying to see how much of a dumpster fire our fandom has been, and especially on what the site formerly known as Twitter. And so I would love to talk to y'all as folks who are researchers of fandom and researchers of internet space about how all of this came to be and why people are having such fundamentally skewed takes about everything related to BTS, Palestine, boycott, etc. And also like how we make informed decisions for ourselves and how to generate realistic, efficacious pro-Palestine action that also supports BTS and recognizing that in many ways these things can and should be related, and also that this is an issue that goes far beyond the bounds of our fandom.
Yeah, definitely. With kind of this whole conversation, I think it's important to start with the timeline of how we've gotten here and how Army for Palestine has developed and how that has turned into a larger movement now that has been recognized by BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction Organization, and also been recognized by larger Palestinian organizations. We'll start with October 7th because I guess that is the date we are going with here, even though, as we all know, the oppression of Palestine and the genocide happening in Palestine has started much before, many years before October 7th, but we're starting there with Army Twitter timeline. So October 7th happens. It's a big deal on the Army Twitter timeline. A lot of people are talking about it. But at that time, there was a lack of organizing because Golden came out. And when Golden came out, which is Jungkook's album that came out in November, I believe, that is when we started to have more serious conversations about organizing.
And I think a large part of that was in seeing how people responded to and how the narrative began to develop within that month related to Palestine at an international level, right? So there's this sort of first thing where you're not quite sure what's going to happen, but after a month of very intense genocidal action that very clearly is not actively addressing the sort of initial purported crime, but is in fact killing thousands of innocent people, there is this sort of realization that this isn't a one-off attack. This isn't something that's going to get pushed under the rug, that this is something that is going to keep going, and that there seems to be a larger push towards complete genocide in these areas for real estate reasons, we now find out, than there is before. I think a lot of the question that I've heard fired a lot is, where were you literally October 8th, right? Like, why wasn't Army for Palestine established in that first month? Why weren't you calling for a boycott immediately? All of these sorts of questions. You have to remember that no one knew what was going to happen for that first month, and that people's priorities and also where public figures stood on the issue was not necessarily as clear. Like, I think anyone who's followed Scooter for a while has known that he's pro-Israel, but there is, I think, a difference between being pro-Israel silently, which is still not great, and blasting an immense amount of misinformation on your timeline about what is happening, posting racist propaganda against Palestinian people, just reporting things that are sheer misinformation, that kind of thing, and using your public platform as an entertainment official. You would not have that blue verified check if you weren't the manager of all of these different artists, and if you weren't affiliated with HYBE America to do that kind of work. And so this starts to be a little bit more of a discussion of, hey, this space isn't safe for us anymore because we have people affiliated with our artists who are pushing a very pro-genocidal timeline.
Yeah, definitely. The way that we have talked about Scooter Braun himself has also drastically changed since October because Army for Palestine themselves weren't established fully until like early November. Like November 17th is when they released their official statement and stance that's pinned on their Twitter. And before that, there was a Palestinian army in particular who did suggest a golden boycott in October. And that Palestinian army has been, number one, run off of Twitter itself. And they, number two, are no longer involved in the organizing around Palestine because people basically crucified them for even suggesting a boycott at that time. Because Army Twitter very much was not ready for that conversation in October, especially with Golden, because Golden itself was an album that was being pushed with streaming and charting from HYBE themselves. So it was just people were not ready or in the place or in the mindset to begin having conversations around boycotting because we did not have the organization present to do that. And number two, we also had our priorities in different places with the Golden release. But following the Golden release, we move into December. And when we move into December, that's when all the BTS members enlist. And with that, with BTS now, and Kate and I have talked about this before, but there's always like this false notion that BTS are like driving the car or driving army. when really it's more of like a symbiotic relationship, and we go back and forth with who's like really like in quote unquote control of the relationship. And BTS have never been in quote unquote control of us. They can give us suggestions of what to do, and we very much follow things with their music and with things they believe themselves as people. But ARMY as a collective can act independently of BTS. And that's in December, that is when we start to see conversations develop around this independence of ARMY and how we act independently of BTS. Because BTS, very clearly, they are enlisted in the Korean military. Kate and I have talked about it on a previous episode already, how you basically have no rights in the Korean military, the South Korean military specifically, any military. But besides the point, very much like BTS themselves are not in the position to say anything publicly about Palestine. So, ARMY, as a collective, have to start making decisions by ourselves without any cues from BTS. And I think that is when the pain points start coming out of how we talk about this. Because November, all of that was on Golden, and the only focus was on Golden. December is when we start talking about, okay, what does a boycott look like? How do we effectively go against Scooter Braun? Because he started to share more propaganda during this time as well. As he started to share more propaganda, ARMY started seriously considering what we can do to act against him and to also fight with Palestinian armies as well, who started to do more formal organizing. Because people keep forgetting this, but when Army for Palestine first started, they did not talk about boycotting at all. There was initially a strike against the four that happened, with the initial strike that happened called on by the journalist Bisan from Palestine, but the strike against the four was not from Army for Palestine. Army for Palestine did support it in some instances, but that was not a formal boycott at all. What happened was that Army for Palestine, from December, January, February, really, that is when they were doing things like calling your representatives, writing to your representatives, doing trending parties. It was all like informative, traditional activist stuff that you first start doing when you're getting a movement started. But they did not start talking about boycotting and supporting a formal boycott until like late February, early March.
Yeah, and I think it's important to really contextualize this, because I think people hear boycott and they get really polarized, and like people start just they stop listening to each other. And I think it's important to contextualize that whether you choose to boycott or not, that is within a larger context of what it means to support Palestine at this particular time, and what does it mean to support Palestine within this specific context and this specific space. The initial sort of pushes for fandom were very much about these strategies that you've just described. And so we're doing this, right? And this is working in tandem with larger movements. But as we're doing this, we start to see Zionists get more vocal in our space, right? In a way in which we could not have predicted. And I think when we talk about Golden and what the focus was on Golden or not, right? Like, we had no idea. Like, I certainly was not following along critically enough to think, oh, Scooter is really going to go off the deep end at this point, right? For this first month of like October, early November. And also in the sort of initial days after October 7th, there isn't also clear information about what's happening. And that's very deliberate, right? So for this first month, everyone's, what just happened? Let's see what's panning out. Also, oh wait, Jungkook has an album, and this is the last album before enlistment, right? And this is an album that we know he wants us to chart and stream. So, okay, we are keeping in mind that Palestine is important as humans, right? We will start this account, but in terms of our organizing and activism strategies, they are matching with or even to what the problem is. And what sort of comes to a head in December, January, February, when the boys leave, as the boys leave, right? And this potentially would be a very different conversation if they were still here, because we'd have other avenues of communication and other avenues of advocacy. But the fact of the matter is we don't, right? There is nothing that they can legally say for the next year and a half, maybe longer than that, arguably, depending on reserve time. And so that means that some of the strategies we would maybe use in the past to reach BTS directly, we can't use them right now. They're fundamentally no longer a thing that we can do, and also are not necessarily a thing that makes sense in this moment. And that's when the conversation, when we study this from a movement building or activism perspective, becomes okay, so we can't do that, right? That avenue is foreclosed to us. And I think everyone can agree on that, right? Because I've seen all the anti boycotters say they can't say anything because they're in the military. Yeah, that's why, right? You need to think of something else to do instead. And so then becomes the question, what makes the most sense? And how does it and should it go beyond just trending a hashtag and emailing your representatives? Because remember, you can do more than one thing, right? And so then it comes to this sort of question, right? What might be effective in mediating Scooter Braun's presence? Because when it comes to how do we approach this from our space as fans, there are tons of things that we can and should be doing in our personal lives outside of being BTS fans that support Palestine. But how do we support Palestine within the context of this space? And why does it make sense to support Palestine as Army in the context of this space? It's because you have one of your top executives at this company saying and doing some crazy things, right? And that's when we start thinking like, okay, what are the pain points? What's going to make sense, right? And some of the early suggestions, and I will stand by, I think these are good suggestions. I think you can do this whether you're boycotting or not, come in the form of sending letters, sending email, ordering and then canceling merch. Even if you still want to order merch, you can order more merch than you intend to order and then cancel half of those orders in order to fundamentally log jam logistically the merch ordering system. There is going to be someone at HYBE who has to report the fact that X number of merch orders were canceled and they were all canceled with this particular reasoning behind them. It's something that will have to be brought up at a meeting, if only so that they can troubleshoot or bug it so that they can block that from happening, but that you have to force a conversation to happen that way. So that's the first thing we see. And that we also see, hey, let's do a letter campaign, let's do an email campaign, let's be as vocal as we can to HYBE about the fact that we do not want people who are advocating for genocide to be in our spaces, which I feel like is a very low bar. We have evicted people from Army spaces for much, much less than that, right? For even saying something negative or implied something negative about BTS, people using BTS for clout, etc. So the fact that this is somehow where people are drawing a line when these are the same fans that are so loyal to and protective of BTS when it comes to artist interactions, when it comes to third party interactions, are not being vocal about this and are not being vocal about the fact that no matter how you identify methods wise and no matter what methods you think are going to be effective or ineffective, that you are not being vocal about getting him out of the space is also something that I think is really indicative of the level of Israeli propaganda that Scooter himself spreads. We know that it is a state sanctioned tactic to attempt as much as possible to paint Israel in a good light, to make it seem like this is a both sides situation, to make it seem that this is a war instead of millions of people being killed and the death count in Israel not rising, right? There is a literal handbook. You can read it. It is 45 pages long, right? That talks about this. And the fact that we are not picking up on that and the fact that we have not immediately seen that as a sort of baseline status quo reason to evict someone, whatever methods we decide to, from our space is wild. And the fact that he has DM'd armies, that he has literally been in the Twitter DMs of people who are well known, right? Of like a user who is well known and fairly beloved across the board in army space, right? The fact that we have not mobilized against him in the same way that we've mobilized against everyone else is something that is a huge red flag to me and is very indicative of the ways in which Zionism has perpetrated this space, whether or not you, wherever you stand in the conflict, right, that it's worked if we don't see it as a clear and immediate thing that we need to get this man out immediately.
Yeah, I was talking about that as well. Like you were talking about how like the propaganda talking points
Mhm.
and how there's a whole handbook for that. Can you talk about some specific examples of how Scooter Braun has been using that?
Absolutely. So this strategy as a sort of state sanctioned term is called hasbara, which is a word that doesn't translate super well from Hebrew, from what I understand, but basically means like explanation, italicized quotation marks loaded, right? Some things that we see here are, first of all, referring to any kind of Palestinian advocacy, violent, nonviolent, whatever, as a riot, or as a terrorist organization instead of being a demonstration or a resistance, right? The ways in which Scooter Braun has named that any journalist from Al Jazeera, which is a well reported, vetted news site, that he's sharing links that say that these journalists are terrorists, that anyone who, and because we can think of journalists as being people who are going to resist occupation through truth telling and through their words. Oh my gosh, just like BTS resists oppression through their words, and who are supposed to be neutral, non-combative, and who are neutral, non-combative sort of reporters. The fact that he is equating them to terrorists is a literal textbook example of Hasbara. The fact that there a lot of Hasbara relies on muddling facts or encouraging people to look away from one set of facts and focus on another set of facts, right? Every time everyone's, what about everyone who's died? He goes, what about the hostages? So that kind of misdirection is very relevant. And also the general sort of painting of Israel as this sort of lone state of Western democracy that is surrounded by hostile Arab powers on all sides. And it's just a little guy and it needs all of our protection, when in reality, the US has signed over multiple billions of dollars of military aid to Israel. So either the US military is not as world renowned as it claims to be, because with all of those millions of dollars of aid, Israel can't defend itself, or clearly there's more stuff going on. So I think you see those kinds of things, and they're pretty solid textbook examples. There are a couple of great Twitter threads that have gone through post by post to debunk this. But I know, Kate, you were saying that this was super similar to the way that solos and antis move and create narratives about people and space and things like that.
Yeah, no, especially like what we've seen, especially more recently, what we've seen a lot on Army Twitter is a lot of people basically using the same patterns and the same techniques that we have previously seen in and antis and other people that generally are up to no good in army spaces, like using the same exact techniques on other army. And so that's been an interesting turn more recently. And a lot of that has been around what one of the things I wanted to say that's related to all this, and it goes back to kind of the early parts of Army for Palestine, and especially leading up into January, February, before the boycott stuff really took off, is one of the big things that they were doing, and then a lot of other pro-Palestine accounts followed suit, was doing a lot of labor around education. So creating these threads that kind of outline a lot of these things, and not just about Scooter, but creating threads that just outline what colonialism is and what the beginnings of Israel and what is this conflict actually about and why is this genocide, like all these like really nice basic foundational things. They were doing lots and lots of educational labor around that. And so then what we've seen more recently is a lot of folks taking that and twisting it and turning it and doing these kind of out of context gotcha moments and things that we have previously seen in solo activity or anti-activity, that is, it's just been alarming to see people just take wholesale those same kind of tactics and turn them around on other army.
Yeah, because it's calculated. There's like steps when it comes to canceling someone or trying to discredit someone. And we see that happen when especially solo stands talk to armies and how they try to gotcha you. And they try to use all of these like straw man fallacies and other fallacies to ensure that you're dismantled and you're like caught off guard and you're not able to defend yourself. Because if you're not upholding yourself to this quote unquote like perfect type of perspective, then you can't criticize others for not being held to that. So it happens like very often. We see this like when people talk about specifically like with the solo stand instance, we see it when people are like, oh, you don't support this member, and then they like look up how many times you've spoken about this thing on their account. Stuff like that is then utilized against Palestinian armies, because they what something that happens a lot is that Palestinian armies and pro-Palestinian armies are getting called multis.
Yeah.
And how anti-boycott armies or like anti-Palestinian armies. I don't exactly want to say that because there's a weird intersection between like how people are pro-Palestinian yet anti-boycott, and I would not exactly call them a Zionist. It's a whole thing. But specifically people who are anti-boycott, they will call Palestinian armies multis by going back through that Palestinian army's account. And if they've that Palestinian army has ever talked about another group previously, then that is somehow evidence of them being a multi and evidence of them being like a cosplayer or a wolf in sheep's clothing in our space who's trying to basically hurt the members, hurt BTS.
Yeah, or even folks like Nas, one of the Boot the Scoot admins, and we'll talk more about Boot the Scoot in a second, going through her personal offline life and saying, oh, your husband works for BlackRock, so therefore you're as equally complicit as like in Israeli genocide or in Israel's genocide as Scooter. And I think for folks who like don't know this, like BlackRock is one of the biggest consulting companies in the world. And being able to, if you are working at BlackRock, they work directly with Google and Amazon and like all of these sort of other big things. And BDS has not pushed for a boycott of a place like BlackRock for that reason, right? Similarly to the way in which BDS has said, Disney is a pressure target, but you can't completely stop engaging in Disney related content because Disney owns everything, right? And so it's this very interesting thing where they're like, what you should be doing is getting your husband to find another job instead of organizing a protest. And it's so clearly the same logic that you'd use as a solo stan to say that the member, you don't care about another member because, right? So I think it's an interesting time for sure.
That's a good word for it. Interesting time.
And
And
with that interesting time, would you like to talk about your interesting time you had
oh,
on Friday?
yes. Yes, absolutely. I had the pleasure of attending the Boot the Scoot protest last Friday, and I'm here to report back. It's the original reason why I ended up on this podcast because I am based in LA, and so I decided that I was going to go. And I think that for context in all of this, think we'll talk more about like boycott efficacy and things later like that. But I think I have been since day one have said if we want to get rid of Scooter, having a protest and making some noise would be helpful about that. And I think maybe before we get into the protest, do we want to maybe break down for in case you are listening and you don't know who Scooter is, but just to give people like very clear timeline of the facts in terms of how Scooter Braun has been perceived in this fandom because I knew him prior to this from the Taylor Swift re-recording case. So I already didn't like him from that. And I think a lot of people were already a little bit like, he doesn't seem great. But do y'all want to maybe break down as folks who have watched him on the timeline and thought about sort of presence? What's up with him? Maybe Kate, do you want to chat about that?
Sure. Yeah, like you said, he's one of those people that never really had a great standing. And even when he was being onboarded and when HYBE was like buying out his company and stuff, I remember there being a lot of noise on the timeline about being like, really? Is this like really what we want to do? There was like some, obviously not enough noise to like really have any traction anywhere, but there was a lot of kind of this kind of we don't really like him and that he's just always been the butt of jokes and stuff in army. He's just been one of those people that like we put up with him, I guess, because he's here, but we don't love it. And I think that and this was one of the early arguments from the anti boycott side of army where they were basically like, oh, I wish you hadn't made a big deal about him being a Zionist, because now we for sure can't get him fired because of religious protection or whatever thing people were cooking up at that time. But because we wanted him gone for these other reasons, because he's skeevy and he does weird things and he's not great with his artists and things. And so there's been this different kinds of push and pull among army. And yeah, so then it's become now obviously things have boiled over because then he went really heavy-handedly with his Zionist propaganda on his Instagram and is now been essentially underhandedly pushing back against army, and the folks he's been hiring are pushing back against the boycott and pro-Palestinian army and Palestinian army. So
Yeah. And I think the hope and actually the trust in the company was that he would be contained a little bit. Like, I remember
Yeah.
when he first was onboarded, I saw a lot of jokes about he better be on hand to just get Namjoon his coffee, right? Like this idea that we're not huge fans of him, but we're hopeful that because he does not own anything anymore, because we bought him out, that he would be contained, right? And sometimes you have to make deals with people you don't like as much in order to get a better foothold in the Western industry. That is what it is. But we trust Hitman Bang. We trust BTS. We trust their board. We think that they'll be able to maybe even make things better than they were under Scooter, right? For people who he had used to work with and stuff like that. Killed the like BTS Taylor Swift collab dream, but we didn't really care about that anyway. Sorry, people who also like Taylor Swift a lot. But anyways, and then I think there was this realization that, oh, he is not contained at all post October 7th. And I think that a lot of that realization was reflected in the fact that there has been such a push and pull over what people have condemned, right, in the wake of this sort of renewed escalation of violence. And I think he very much thought he could get away with anything he wanted when the narrative was still relatively pro Israel. But as the death count has continued, as the footage has continued to be released, as Israel has outed itself on TikTok for all of the deeply terrible things that have happened over the past almost now, what, 5, 6 months, right? It has become clear that there's been like a little bit more of a change in the narrative, at least on the US side, about who people are believing and what people are believing. And things like the TikTok ban are very evident in that. And I think that there was a moment, though, and a very clear inflection point where he showed his true colors and then has continued to show them in a way that has been deeply alarming. And hence the movement to get him removed from HYBE. And I think per your comments about like religiosity and its role in like discrimination law, I think that what's really important here is to critically think through what is your stated ideal end goal and what are your realistic goals. And honestly, we can compare this to the way in which armies chart and buy things, right? That our goal is always to aim for the top of the chart, but we recognize that our realistic goal is going to be somewhere in the middle, right? That like we can't have a number one every single time because Billboard hates us, right? And so I think that is how I would recommend approaching this, right? That in the most ideal world, we can Jake Codish him, right? He can suddenly disappear from all of our projects and we never have to see him again. And the fact that mobilizing against Jake Codish work is a sign that we can remove Zionists from our space when we are loud and vocal and when they keep saying and doing racist things and terrible things. And for context, Jake Codish was a super pro-Israel backup dancer that was originally part of Jungkook's Golden, like the Golden Boys, like the set of dancers that were run by Brian Puspos. He said a lot of crazy things. All of a sudden, he wasn't at the last few Golden performances, and we have not heard from him since, right? And he was replaced with someone else. And I think in the most ideal world, Scooter is completely deposed from HYBE. He no longer makes money off the boys. We no longer have to see him. He does not associate whatsoever. I think there are a lot of important middle goals that I do think are much more realistic, right? If he ever posts a picture with the boys again or puts their names in his mouth, I would love to see that be like flattened from the earth, right? I should not hear him talking anymore about BTS in any context. I do not want their name coming out of his mouth, period. And I do not want him using them for clout on social media, right? Which is, again, a thing that we have constantly been like, hey, shady people using BTS are a thing that this fandom does not stand for. And so for a shady person to post a picture of BTS that will generate traffic towards an Instagram page that also will show you on his stories constantly pro-Israel content is not something that we should want as a fandom. And again, regardless of where you stand on various issues, the fact that the content is misinformation and the content is racist, right? Period. Full stop, right? I think that there is a world in which we see him less heavy-handedly in BTS specific projects. I think that's very possible. And he stays in his little own corner, and then we can work on getting him evicted from his own corner. I think that he has already had to walk back a ton of his social media presence. And that is a sign that things are working. And that is a sign that we need to keep pushing, right? He has done an immense amount of damage control. Immense in that it is like alienating some of his pro-Israel supporters, not immense in that he's actually done anything good, right? But the fact that he had to literally start another campaign with his token Palestinian friend to prove that he was also going to donate money to support Palestinian children and to change his rhetoric from Israel needs to be protected to I just want the hostages returned, right? That walk back is a huge win. And the fact that he posted a ton of this content the first time that people started mobilizing and petitioning against him, and the fact that he posted a second round of that content at the same time as the Boot the Scoot protest makes this very clear, right? He has always been someone that has been worried about and has fought to protect his reputation within the music industry. And so keeping him and pushing him towards that is never a bad thing, in my opinion. And I think that even if I absolutely do not condone the performative activism, I can play both sides rhetoric that he's pushing forth right now, the fact that we've even forced him to do that from someone who was really and is really not about that and meets with the Israeli government and all that stuff, right, is a sign that things are working, right? And is better than nothing if we want to just be like blunt about it. And so I think that recognizing that those are the midterm goals, right, is like helpful and maybe helpful in contextualizing why people are doing what they're doing. And we saw that damage control actually at the Boot the Scoot protest, which was an in-person protest at the HYBE America headquarters in LA. And I would say maybe at its peak, there were like 50 or so people who showed up, despite Twitter claims to the contrary. Most of those people were Army. And what was really wonderful was that the people who weren't Army became closer to being Army because of this. So when people are talking about, oh, this is like terrible that this is going outside the fandom, we are reaching people who are new listeners of BTS music. We are reaching people that are potential fans, or at least understand and will validate the legitimacy of BTS within a musical space, within a fandom space, within an activism space, which is so important given the ways in which BTS and Army are dismissed and belittled, right? So you have to recognize that this is helpful social capital, right? And it was honestly a really lovely experience. I was really impressed. I was a little bit concerned given the fact that some people had the audacity to threaten to call the LAPD and wish death upon protesters. That was crazy. And the fact, again, is in our space is deeply concerning and should concern everyone, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum. But it was really well planned. They had all of the correct permits. They knew exactly where we needed to be placed to avoid any kind of police confrontation. They had very excellent backup plans for what could or would happen in the face of potential aggression. They had QR codes ready for everyone to sign. They had fun pro-Palestine photo cards, and they had snacks, they had water, and they had a number of very great chants that I 10 out of 10 for whoever planned those chants. And as people have mentioned, it was a mass mandatory protest, like a lot of other protests are and have been across the timeline for since COVID. That should not have come as a shock to anyone. And also very important when it comes to facial surveillance technology related stuff. So that has been a thing that everyone has said mass recommended or mass required. So again, don't know why there was noise about that on the timeline. There shouldn't have been. And it was a really lovely experience. Some of it was stationary. There was some marching back and forth along the block. Lots of folks doing some lovely solidarity, car honking, that kind of thing. Some folks who were Army that flew in from other places. A couple of other folks from other HYBE fandoms, but I'd say mostly Army. Again, also despite potential claims to the contrary that there were going to be non-Army there, it was going to be taken over by non-Army, mostly Army. I would say it has perhaps been the most aggressive counter protesting that I've seen in terms of people screaming at us from cars, or more concerningly, school buses, people stopping their cars to yell at us, people blocking protest routes with their cars, lots of vulgar gestures, lots of vulgar things said. I think all of that only made it more apparent, right, who is on the right side of history, and that the things that were being screamed were just like Palestinians should die, right? Or F Palestine, those kinds of things, which is, I think, definitely not what people on the other side are saying, right? At some point before I got there, Scooter's pro-Palestinian friend did appear at the protest and tried to convince people that they shouldn't be protesting and that Scooter had donated a lot of money behind the scenes. While I wasn't there for that interaction, he did hang out at the protest and film us for a decent amount of time, honestly, because I remember seeing him and just being like, who is this man who's like hiding behind the Universal Music Building, filming us on his phone and trying to act nonchalant? And we made a lot of eye contact. And I was like, who are you? And so he was there. So Scooter knows that this is happening, and Scooter's actively trying to stop it from happening. So again, it's making noise in the sort of way we would want it to. And then I think a really lovely moment was I had talked to some of the protest organizers while we were marching, because I was thinking a lot about how songs like Standing Next to You and Louder Than Bombs feel really applicable and really resonant in the situation. And if there was anything BTS specific that we could do as part of this protest and as part of recognizing that art has been and always will be political, particularly art designed to resist oppression. And so I was like, what if we sang Spring Day? Could we sing Spring Day? And it was really wonderful and cool that actually happened. We mostly relied on fan chants and one native Korean speaker who really popped off. And it was a really beautiful experience. It was beautiful to dedicate that to folks in Gaza, particularly given this parallels between the Sewol Ferry incident and between sort of children who are being killed in Gaza right now. And I'm glad that we were able to do that. It was very surreal to see that be in the Koreaboo article about the protest, and also just generally surreal to see Koreaboo being one of our staunchest allies in the pro Palestine, anti scooter moment. That was certainly a moment. And then, unfortunately, and this was actually right after I left, there were eggs that were thrown at people, which also, again, not great, but they all missed. So at least there was a bright side to that. And I think this is, again, a very good example of these are things that are, number one, sanctioned by everyone you need to be sanctioned, like Palestinian Youth Movement, BDS, where everyone signed off on this protest as being efficacious and as being helpful to the larger movement. Because again, that's been the cry is, this isn't going to be helpful. This isn't going to be useful for all of the pro-Palestine but anti-boycott army. None of this action is useful. None of this action is relevant. Everyone else said it was relevant. And we've gotten some really lovely mentions of folks saying, hey, this is going to change or at least start a conversation about Zionism in art and Zionism in the entertainment industry. I know there were also some concerns about folks allying with the Democratic Party for Socialism and Liberation, and specifically accusing the protest of being pro-communist in a way that would hurt the boys who are obviously in a very sort of tense communism capitalist situation. I think that was also an interesting way in which people were moving like solos or moving like antis, both in that we have allied with other fandoms before, even if we don't agree with everything that they do, for specific causes, i.e., like this, and also that every BTS member who has spoken about reunification has been pro reunification. And that doesn't mean being pro communism, but simply being pro the fact that people in South Korea and North Korea have not seen their family members for upwards of 40 or 50 years, right? And that there is a lot of oppression that is happening in North Korea. And that Yoongi's literally written music about this. So to see people get canceled for saying Koreans want reunification, also very wild to me. And again, an example of a lot of false equivalence, a lot of not lending any kind of nuance to the situation, and a lot of not recognizing what BTS has actually said. And I think that's something that's become very clear to me, is that there's this large narrative that, pro Palestinian and particularly pro boycott armies are acting like BTS is helpless or that we know better than BTS, when in fact, a lot of the people that are pushing back by arguing things like anti reunification have very clearly not been listening to BTS themselves and very clearly have not been listening to BTS's message when it comes to a lot of sort of these different issues, and have very clearly not recognized that BTS, like Namjoon and Tae in particular, have been supporters of Palestinian resistance art specifically, right? And so whether you agree with tactics or not, just like recognizing that they've been vocal about this kind of stuff, at least like tacitly, for a while now. So yeah, but overall, I just really have to commend the organizers of the protest. They did a really good job. It felt like a very safe space. And I think there is something so humanizing about seeing people in real life and recognizing that people are more than Twitter clapbacks. And I think that's something that can really get lost in the ways in which people are feuding with each other right now. That when you meet people and see that they have absolutely the best intentions, that they care about BTS just as much as you do, that they feel as impacted by everything going on in the world as you do. I think it really makes you realize that specific ideology nitpicking is not as important as all of us doing what we can to remove Zionists from our space and to support Palestine in the process.
Yeah, and I also would like to say that I'm really proud of what the protest has been able to do. Like having a physical manifestation of all that we've been doing has been liberating, I'll do say, because I feel like a lot of our advocacy has been online, which is not to discredit online advocacy at all, because online advocacy, especially in our today world, is crucial for every movement. But very much, I am really proud of what the Palestinian armies and pro-Palestinian armies have been able to organize, and I think it's great, honestly. With this whole conversation too, I really want to talk about how we message about the boycott and about the movement, and especially around how we message centering BTS. I had a Twitter thread recently where I talked about how like I was very frustrated with the fact that when we talk about Palestine and we talk about the boycott, we keep having to come back to talk about BTS with that as well, when very much it's not about BTS at this point. It's like very much a HYBE, Scooter Braun type of thing. But we keep having to come back and talk about BTS because that's all the other side will listen to. And it's become increasingly frustrating for me, especially because I feel like the focus on BTS that people keep drawing is completely disingenuous. Mari, you lightly touched on this about how people worry about how things will affect BTS. But every time people talk about that, I feel like it's sincerely disingenuous with how anti-boycotters have been treating pro-boycott armies and how we've seen, like with Na, for instance, and how her husband was specifically doxxed, and how we've seen other Palestinian armies be doxxed, and how a lot of Palestinian armies, like earlier I talked about the one Palestinian army who advocated for the golden boycott in October and November, they're run off basically. Just this morning, we saw BTS Content Index, a fan base that has existed for many years now, come out as pro boycott. And after coming out as pro boycott, they closed the account because it was too much at that point. And we're seeing that with things like BTS Hourly Study Twitter, that account as well. We saw it had three admins, two admins pro Palestine, I believe, and one admin anti boycott. And that admin took over the account, and now that account is under the anti boycott admin. And the anti boycott admin also isn't even the admin who started the account. Wild times, guys, wild. Explaining this to someone outside of Army Twitter, I feel like we all know, we've all done it before,
Yeah.
and it has been a trip.
I've been trying to explain this to people outside Twitter daily, and we could have another whole 2-hour podcast just explaining blow by blow what has been happening.
Yeah. Should we maybe talk a little bit about what boycotting actually is, number one, and then two, what are your different options for action, right? Because I feel like all of this conversation doesn't have as much relevance if we don't talk about, okay, so what are next steps, right? We've already established that if you are just anti shady people being in our spaces, that like supporting efforts to remove Scooter directly makes sense. And so whether that's signing the petition, please sign the petition, or showing up to physical protests to remove him, or at least not attacking people who are attempting to remove him, that seems like a solid baseline. And if also you want to engage in things like ordering and canceling merch, which again, have no impact on the boys' financial revenue unless you really wanted 5 sets of the same thing anyway. Those are all things that I really hope we can agree on as baseline actions as a fandom, right? It should not take much for any of us to ask someone else that and for any one of us in the fandom to do that. Where I think things have gotten a little bit more polarizing has been in the realm of boycotting and what does it mean to be pro boycott? What is the boycott? And so I think the first thing is that boycotting specifically does not mean canceling. I think there's a lot of false parallels that are drawn within the context of particularly this era of boycotting in support of Palestine that have made it seem, oh, to boycott means to not support BTS and to boycott means to actively harm BTS because the goal of boycotting Starbucks, McDonald's, etc., is to actively harm those companies. But I feel like folks need to realize that in the larger history of boycotting, a lot of times you boycott specific in order to get like sort of infrastructural things changed. Like the most famous boycott in like American history, right? The Montgomery bus boycott was not because people were anti-bus, like people loved the transit, right? The goal was to make sure that like buses were equitably accessible to everyone, right? And that there would be no discrimination in the bus space. And so the idea of potentially boycotting anything now is rooted in that, right? It's not rooted in hating BTS. It's not rooted in trying to deplatform BTS. It's rooted in what is going to potentially force the company to have a conversation about the ways in which it supports and enables Zionists right now, which fundamentally by platforming Scooter, right, and by anytime Scooter gets engagement that's related to HYBE, HYBE proper, HYBE America, whatever, that is promotion. Whether it's intentional or not, whether you and the company believe in Zionism or not, that ends up being promotion. And there's no getting around that, right? And one of the suggestions that has been put forth has been to boycott products and boycott output, right? And so there are a bunch of different priority levels of this. It could be not buying merch at all. It can be not streaming at all. It can be not putting like specifically like putting extra views on videos, right? And obviously like that's something that's going to be very difficult to market to the BTS audience. I think that crowdsourced funding, crowdsourced streaming, and crowdsourced viewing has been for a long time one of the most radical ways in which BTS has been able to fight against racism and fight against white supremacy. And it's really important to people, understandably, because without those tools, we would never have the success as a fandom that we have now. So the idea that we don't do this, or that we hold off on this, or that we think about reframing this is going to be shocking for some people. And definitely for me, I was like, oh, does this make sense? Or how does this make sense at the beginning? And so I think that's super fair, right? And I don't think that anyone who is pro boycott should be, and hopefully is not, telling people that if they decide to stream anyway that they're automatically like a genocide supporter, right? Or that if you don't follow every single level of the boycott that like you're immediately also canceled. And I do think the like very violent and like rhetoric language of that, not helpful, just is simply not going to push people in the middle towards your side. I do think that people are entitled to be angry, people are entitled to be upset, and people are absolutely entitled to, as personal fans, draw their own sort of hardcore lines about who they do not approve of or interact with. I think that's what we've always done, right? Some people don't like fanfic writers, some people don't like people who go to 5 concerts in a row, right? Whatever that is, like people have different like lines that they personally draw. But what has been like wild about this has been seeing the ways in which that has been used, as you've discussed, actively deplatform people who are doing quite a lot of good for the community and have been institutional accounts for a really long time. If a lot of your fandom institution accounts are collectively saying, hey, maybe this is something we should think about, or hey, this is at least something that we want to address, or at least we are not going to ban it, right? And we're not going to say this is unacceptable, right? There's probably a reason everyone's saying that. And so I think that's worth thinking about critically. And I also think that if you are like, and you as an individual consumer can choose what level of boycotting you want, right? And I think what's been really helpful for me has been seeing the boycott list of priorities and making the choice that like I will be at tier 5 for this release, or I will be at tier 6 for this release, whatever that might be. And so I think that recognizing that people can be at different tiers, but that you should be doing something, is the kind of nuance and lack of polarization that would be great to see a little bit more in the space.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Listeners, you guys, the listeners, if you want to specifically find the HYBE boycott priorities list, you can look on Twitter, HYBE boycott priorities list, or you can specifically go to BTS Prod Suga, BTS PROD Suga, SUGA. This person's account, they're the one who made the HYBE boycott priorities list. It has a baseline priority and then 6 priorities in addition to that, with the 6th priority being no engagement on HYBE channels at all, so no engagement with any of HYBE or any affiliated social media, and then the baseline being about talking about Palestine online and offline. and you can choose through there and see what you want to align yourself with. What I've been really talking about with other armies is like finding a way to align what you think about with your actions, specifically because I've been involved in funding spaces before. And like something really crucial is that you may have committed previously to this one thing or thinking about this one thing, but if you think differently about it now, how can you align yourself with what you're thinking, what you're feeling right now? Because I feel like there's some armies who are still continuing to stream and buy and fund and crowdfund and do a lot of these things when that is not aligning with how they're currently feeling about Palestine and the boycott. And I really ask listeners if you feel like you're doing stuff right now that's now aligning with how you feel about the boycott and about Palestine and just larger issues in the world. I really think it's important you critically think about that and try to align your life in a way that you can live it and feel more comfortable with what you're doing and feel that you're doing something meaningful.
Yeah. And I think it's opened up a really important conversation about what it means to support BTS as a whole. And Kate, I know you've talked about that in some depth. Do you want to address what that can and might mean in a way that's maybe important for the fandom to reckon with?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot more broadly, not just in this context. It's just something I've been thinking about a lot in general. But I've seen a lot of kind of rhetoric on the timeline around, specifically around the boycott, and using language like, I'm going to support BTS. I can't do the boycott because I need to support BTS. And there's just like this use of the word support equates a lot for a lot of people with monetary support or resource support. And I guess for me, my question to listeners and to Army more generally is what, other ways might we be able to support BTS? Is racking up numbers or pushing for a certain amount of sales or whatever, is this the only way we support BTS? I don't think as a fandom this has ever been the only way we support them, right? And just because we're asking to boycott certain things doesn't mean we take the other forms of support away. So things like writing to them on Weverse. They give us platforms to do this, right? They've given us avenues to support them outside of streaming and buying and watching videos. So writing on Weverse, when people do fan edits, when people write fan fiction, when people do all these other kinds of things that support the fandom and support the community, that ultimately then is supporting BTS. And it's not all about numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a big part of this is making sure that people understand. And I do think the language on this can be and can continue to be clarified. You don't have to stop listening to BTS music. The boycott is of the things that actively make the company money,
Yes.
not of BTS as artists, right? And that's a very crucial difference. BTS for years has released physical albums with CDs in them, has as of more recently released digital Weavers albums that don't really count for anything unless they're bundled into a larger package, right? They would not be releasing these things if they did not want you to do anything besides stream, right? If they just wanted you to stream, then you would not get a physical edition of the album to listen to. And granted, CD players not as much in vogue as they used to be, right? But things like releasing LPs or releasing records, like these are designed to be ways in which you interact with and support BTS through consuming their music that aren't just reliant on numbers and on buying. And I think that this was like a really helpful awakening for me. That was okay. I think there's so much internalized sort of guilt or shame pressure about streaming, some of which is like really well intentioned, but it was like to a point where like prior to this, I would want to listen to the Weaver's album editions because the sound quality is just so good. Like she's so crisp. But I would feel guilty if I listened to those because I wasn't actively contributing to streams or supports or supporting through streaming. See, like I'm using the language right now, right? The language has been baked into how I talk about this. And I was like, wait, it's always been okay to listen to the Weavers albums if I feel like listening to the Weavers albums. I don't have to optimize and maximize my participation in fandom based on streaming and numbers, right? And this would be the case whether I was boycotting or not. And I think it's worth mentioning too that this focus on taking away money or accomplishment or profit from the boys. I've seen people accuse other people of, oh, that's illegal, you're taking their music from them or whatever, right? Also, I don't think pays a ton of attention to the ways in which not everyone has access to being able to stream and buy in the first place. Certainly not anyone in Palestine right now, and definitely a lot of folks in a lot of other places, whether it's because I know, as was pointed out before we started recording, there are some countries that don't have iTunes, right? So they can't hit that iTunes #1 goal. Or simply in that if I had been 15 or 16 when I started as an army, I would literally just not have the money. And my parents would not have the money to do all of the things from a consumer standpoint that I do now when it comes to being able to buy albums and things like that. I would have asked for my $25 iTunes gift card for my birthday, scratched off the code, and downloaded the tracks and listened to them that way because I literally would not have been able to afford these kinds of things. And that's why I also think, again, funding bases have been really wonderful in providing people access to resources so that they can listen to music too. And I don't ever want to discredit that as being important, but I do want to recognize that, yeah, there are other things you can do to support BTS that aren't reliant on that, and that you don't have to stop listening to BTS music if you want to support Palestine. And I think really making that language clear in all of the messaging and making sure that people are united on that front seems quite important to me because I think that's where a lot of folks have gotten lost in the sauce, or it's immediately triggering, like, oh, people are boycotting or canceling BTS kind of thing.
Can I just add, while we're talking about things that BTS has given us that they don't care about necessarily streaming numbers on, the SoundCloud songs, for one, are some of my favorite songs that aren't available on other platforms, and the hidden tracks. So we've got C, one of my absolute favorites, and then Letter from Face Off. So this is recent. This is recent. Jimin gave us Letter, and that was a hidden track. And so there's things that kind of out there in the ecosystem that show us there's a much more complex environment going on here than just whatever's on iTunes and Spotify.
When we're specifically talking about the high, like when we're specifically talking about how we support BTS too, I didn't mention this beforehand, but like, we all remembered how that one fan artist got canceled for being pro boycott, right? And how people started to steal their art and started threatening to report them and also to sell their art with, which is a whole thing. There's a whole thing about fan art and copyright law and how fan art technically is not legal, yet we're just gonna hang out, right? Because something I always advocate for, people are not gonna like me for saying this, but transformative works make a fandom. Like transformative works includes fan art, fan fiction, fan edits, both video and photo, and any type of creative fan work. So things like when people do crochet plushies of BTS or BT21, that is a transformative fan work. And these transformative fan works are protected under transformative fan laws. And these laws protect fandoms and allow them to engage with a lot of fan content. There's some countries that have stricter copyright laws and don't have any transformative protection laws. You just cannot make anything that is like transformative work in that country. It's a little wild. And of course there's also things like in Japan where they have a little like looser. They have a big like doujinshi culture, which is like a fan-made manga of a manga or anime. And all those types of things are important and crucial to fandoms and things that we should support and we should value in a fandom space. And I don't want to be like, what's it called, defeatist or hyperbolic, but the way that fan works have become devalued in army spaces in return for only valuing things like streaming and buying, which inherently costs money. There's a lot of money shaming classes and things going on with this whole conversation. And when it comes to like, making transformative fan work, all that's free. You can just do it, post your little doodle online, hang out. You don't need a $600 iPad to make fan art and post it online. Like those things are important and they're important ways of engaging the community and supporting BTS. Like BTS have seen our fan art before. Jimin's tattoo, his moon tattoo on his back was inspired by fan art. Jungkook makes He makes fan video edits for BTS. Jungkook is a fan video editor. Write that, quote that. Okay, put it in an article.
And he likes Namjoon fan art. That we know has happened at least
Yes.
once.
But BTS have supported fan works before, and of course, whenever we center BTS, this whole conversation also does not need a center on BTS. But fan works are crucial for a fandom, and they also support BTS, even if it's not quote unquote direct support that people see through numbers. It's a way of supporting BTS that I feel like we are losing a lot of in our space, especially on Twitter. On Tumblr, they're hanging out, they're living their best lives. But on Twitter, I think very specifically, like I see fan artists that I really love echo this a lot, that the engagement on Twitter is just not there anymore. And a lot of them have moved to Instagram or just moved to Tumblr or have completely stopped creating art. There was an artist a couple years ago who created these trophy artworks for BTS. And then she completely stopped because people just were not respecting her art and were like trying to profit off of it. And this timeline of disrespect of transformative works is in tandem the timeline of an increase of focus on streaming and numbers and charting. And with that intersecting, we're seeing the downfall of the fandom itself. That's what I'm feeling.
And I do want to give a shout out to the folks who are hanging in there, like BTS X Crafts and a couple of other folks that have done fan art drives for Gaza and fan art drives for Palestine. So again, there are ways that you can support BTS, support Palestine, and you can even still spend money if you want to. You don't have to not spend money. And I got a number of lovely Ta stickers, a very cute sticker of like all the alcohol bottles that the boys left on the show. And all of the profits from that went directly to orgs on the ground that are providing immediate aid and relief to folks in Palestine. So I think shout out to the fan artists who are hanging in there. But yeah, what an important part of being able to support BTS, right? You can learn a dance challenge, right? You can do so many things that equate to supporting BTS. I have a set of enlistment goals that are not directly related to BTS, but involve running a half marathon and performing in X number of traditional dance concerts. And those are my Jin and Yoongi goals, respectively. But there are just so many things that you can do that go beyond streaming and that go beyond numbers. And I think that it's okay, especially of all times now, to focus on that. And so I just hope that folks recognize that like it doesn't have to be an either or situation in that regard. So I guess all of this is pretty timely because we've had a very lovely content heavy month from BTS. It's Yarch, it's mid-March. I love you, Yoongi. We had Friends last week. Shout out to the pro-Palestinian director of that music video. And this week we have Hope on the Street. Hots is happening. And first of all, may I say to everyone who was deeply upset that Palestinian images were used to portray Hope on the Street, let me remind you that first of all of the art that J-Hope has learned, that all of J-Hope's dance forms are anti-oppressive, anti-colonial art developed by Black American communities to combat racism and oppression. Hip hop culture, rap culture, that includes dance culture, is all part of a very long anti-oppressive tradition, just as all of BTS's rap music is and forever will be. And they've talked about this at length. And so much of what J-Hope does that I think is really great as an Asian artist is crediting and then going back to learn from different Black practitioners of these art forms. So the idea that people would say, hey, what does Hope on the Street represent? And apply that to Palestine is a very logical progression of all of those things and a very beautiful progression. Like what Hope is on the streets of Gaza, of Rafah, of everywhere that's protesting right now. And doing that has gotten some great traction from locals who are interested in this album, who are interested in BTS because they've seen this artwork and because the artwork is so powerful based on this theme of Hope on the Street. And if you are upset about that, then either you don't want more pro-Palestinian people to join the fandom, or you don't make those connections for yourself in a way in which I'm like, then why are you supporting J-Hope, right? Like you're clearly not supporting him as a whole three-dimensional person, right? And so all of that aside, we hit into this question of what are we going to do when the album releases, given the overall boycott messaging, and then also the fact that there is a very known vocal Zionist that produced, unfortunately, one of the tracks on the album. What are y'all doing? I'm curious.
I'm gonna I'm gonna listen to it in alternative ways and then not buy it or stream it in the ways. Yes.
Same. Yes.
I think for me, my strategy with this album is I will probably purchase one physical copy and then listen to the physical copy. And again, this is a great example of people having different strategies that ultimately engage with the same goal. I would like to physically have the physical copy. I would like to see all of the sort of work he's put into developing a physical copy of the album. And I think the album, like physical album design, is like a big part of appreciating their art, like being able to physically hold and interact with that. And that's something that's still important to me. Um, but it comes with a CD and I can listen to the CD. And that solves a lot of the sort of various qualms about things. I think, again, there are different options if you do intend to buy. You can avoid track 3 specifically. And I don't think that for folks that are like, oh, but what if J Hope is upset about this? I think that's perhaps asking the wrong question right now. And the other thing here being that if you are specifically choosing not to buy or not to fund that track, like the message that sends is perhaps even more striking in some ways than not buying the album as a whole. People who are like, I can get canceled like 8 ways to Sunday for that one. But I do think if people very clearly see, like, we don't support and we don't enable these kinds of folks in our spaces, like, that's super valid. And I think that BTS has had a track record of doing this, or at least thinking about this when it comes to people who have been accused of criminal activity that is like morally reprehensible, right? The whole like Bobby Jung thing, even though he's on a lot of their songs. And so I think whatever you choose to do, at least think about it critically when you do it. And definitely, I would just encourage everyone to be really thoughtful and generous in how you respond to people who are not doing the exact same thing as you, and being really thoughtful and strategic about how you engage with people who you think you can move the needle on, right? And how far do you think that needle is going to go? There are some people that I know in the fandom where we're never going to agree 100% on every single tactic or on every single sort of piece of strategy. But there are things that I know that I can ask different levels of mobilization, that I can ask of different folks based on knowing who they are and based on knowing where they stand. And so I just highly encourage people to think about that critically. I think I highly encourage folks who are still trying to disconnect or separate all of these different issues to also just do the work of thinking about the bigger picture here in the way in which BTS has always encouraged us to do. They've always encouraged us to put their art in context. They've always encouraged their art to be a literal connector to the rest of the world. They had the BTS Connect exhibit for a reason. And so as you think about what it means to support BTS and what it means to support art and what it means to support humanity in this particular and terrible time that we're in, I think that getting into that sort of bigger picture ideology and also recognizing how that can play out and impact our particular space that we have curated and that we would love to remain safe and that we would love to remain diverse and that we would love to remain supportive of basic humanity, if nothing else, seems like an important call to action for everyone.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. When it comes to things like people still buying the album, I always like reference back to how when we watch things like the Grammys, for instance, like when we watch the Grammys, we only watched it until BTS were there and then we leave afterwards. So we show up and we show like the official numbers that like, hey, armies care about BTS. they want to watch this thing because of BTS, and we'll watch the other acts respectfully because that's what we do. Because Army has gone to things like a Jingle Ball and other events and shown up and cheered for other artists as well. But then we leave afterwards because that's a way of us showing that, hey, we're here for BTS and not for this other XYZ thing. And I think when it comes to album buying, I'm okay when people talk about it and think about it in like that type of context and think about like how they're critically consuming it. I always tell people like when you're buying albums, think about where you're buying the album and how it's going to be transported and things like that as well if you're going to buy it. There's things like group ordering and ordering multiple copies that I feel a little weird about, but we'll see how it goes. I think Neuron is going to be our first instance of like how we're going to interact with BTS releases with kind of boycott priorities list and onward. And we'll see where we go from there and how we're going to exactly build out this movement further beyond just the boycott, which is a lot to begin with, by the way, but like how do we move this movement forward even more? Anyway, any final thoughts, Kate?
Final thoughts. Yes, I feel like it's all been said at this point in the episode, but for me, there's a lot of different things going on. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of strong opinions happening within the community. And I have said this multiple times on Twitter, and I'll say it again here, but I'm just hoping that everyone is taking this opportunity. We're in this kind of chapter 2 military enlistment era to really reflect on, as individuals, our own practices and our own engagement with BTS and BTS content, but also what are we as individuals and as a community, what are we in the world? What are we doing? And I think that having this kind of really human-centered, humanity-oriented social movement it's important to me, and I think it's important to a lot of folks in this community. And despite all the chaos that's been happening and some of the not so great things that have been happening, I have seen a lot of people coming out and coming forward for social justice and for Palestine and for kind of the larger movement. And that is what helps me go to sleep at night, is thinking about these folks that are making this effort and that are putting themselves out there and taking risks, especially right now when it is still risky to be vocal about these things. And that's what I'm going to keep myself warm with, is that we're just going to keep pushing this. And I hope that people keep reflecting and engaging and learning, and that we can come together as a community around this.
I so deeply echo that. I think I've been really grateful for the many ways in which I have learned and grown throughout this entire process, as actually awful as everything about everything has been. I think that what gives me a lot of hope on the street and everywhere else is, first of all, that I one, that there are so many people who have really done the work and have really done a remarkable job with that work. And I just want to take this like time to give an official shout out to every Palestinian and pro-Palestinian army who has done the labor, who has done the engagement, who has put together like really remarkable campaigns, who has put together stuff that I think like I will be using as like case examples in my classes. And I know that there have been a lot of things that haven't been perfect, and there are a lot of things that have been messy. And I think it's a good thing to remember for all of us that every movement for freedom has been messy, and that the sanitization of the disagreements within those movements, of the ways in which people did not always see eye to eye on things, is often erased and tamped down by history in some really specific and critical ways, like any major freedom movement. And so it's worth remembering that it's going to be messy no matter what, but also that we can individually be kind and thoughtful about our actions to each other, and we can still engage in good faith dialogue. And I think every time I see a good faith dialogue happen where people walk out of it uncanceled and unscathed, it gives me hope for the fact that there are still folks who recognize what being in this fandom is about. And I think I also am really excited and curious about potential here. That I think some of the wins that we've seen were not wins that I expected to see. I was deeply skeptical about things. I think Jake Kodish really changed my mind about some of that. But I think that as we've seen, like slightly more clear messaging, slightly more unified messaging, slightly more unified priorities, I would just really focus on what that sort of line is. There will always be people on the fringes of everything who will be yelling very loudly about stuff, but there is a sort of clear directive that's being handed in a very easily digestible format to everyone who's a member of this fandom. And I hope that we continue to do what this fandom stands for, which, and to do what this fandom has and always has been about from day one, which is supporting and believing in the humanity of other people and using music as a conduit and as motivation to do that.
And with that, we come to a close. Some of my final thoughts, basically, keep boycotting, keep moving, keep emailing, keep calling your representatives. I'm really proud of just like all the work everyone has done towards a free and liberated Palestine. And I think a lot of times when you're just in the movement and you're just going, you're not able to reflect back and think about the battles you've won. Army has won a lot of battles. Even just boot to scoot happening was a battle won. And it's proof that we are capable of organizing. And there's always been proof that we're capable of organizing, like in the physical world. But getting that proof that we can do something like that and do it like really well and really effectively means that there's opportunity for us to do more. And I'm really excited to see where this movement goes and how we can continue supporting each other in this movement. And with that is not all for now, but we do have to end this, so I guess we're ending it, but that's all. But we'll be back. And thank you so much to Mariko, our guest for today. I appreciate all your knowledge and all the goodness that you have brought to this podcast episode. And also shout out to Kate, even though I see you every single time, because it's almost like we do this podcast together. Just shout out, and also shout out to myself for existing, because I was canceled and that was hard, but it's okay. We're gonna still keep going because I believe
Yes.
in a free and liberated Palestine, even if I'm canceled.
Yes.
But yeah, thank you all so much for listening. As always, please remember, continue supporting a free and liberated Palestine and listen to some BTS music as well, because they have radical messages in there. It is true. If you read the lyrics, which you should do, by the way. Anyway, have a good day. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Oh my gosh, I get to be included in the bye.
What's up, guys? We're back. Real quick, we're gonna donate $50.70 because that is all the profit we've made from this podcast since the beginning. Yay! Literally, just to clarify, we do not profit from this podcast. We have sunk more money into it than anything else because it costs money to host things on Spotify, if you didn't know. It also costs money in my labor to edit all of these videos. So we will be donating $50.70, which is what we've earned from this podcast, to the PCRF.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, to the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund, which is the PCRF. We'll post proofs of that on the Twitter account, and it'll be linked in the description. But I encourage you guys to also donate to the PCRF with matching us $50.70 if you can, or anything you can afford to donate. But yeah, that's it. We don't make money off of this. Just to clarify, literally, we can give you the receipts. We don't.
And we don't make money to be guests on this either. In fact, we put off our money generating labor to be guests on the podcast. For anyone who was mentioning that, that's not how this works. And actual bye.
That's it. Thank you. Go
Bye.
donate. Bye.